The crack of the judge's gavel sounded like a bone breaking. And in that moment, in a sterile courtroom in a sleepy Washington town, 16-year-old Lucas Thorne's life was officially over. "It is the judgment of this court," Judge Evelyn Reed said, her voice cold and flat as a headstone, "that you, Lucas Thorne, be committed to the Washington State Department of Corrections for the rest of your natural life. You are not eligible for parole." Life without parole. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Someone in the gallery let out a choked sob. The court artist's pencil stopped moving. Every single person in that room was holding their breath, waiting for a reaction from the boy at the defense table. This kid, with his fresh face and his neatly combed hair, who should have been thinking about prom and college applications. Now a convicted murderer. And what did Lucas do? He smiled. It wasn't a big, crazy grin. Nothing like that. It was just a faint, subtle tug at the corners of his mouth. A tiny, cold flicker in his eyes. He looked directly at Judge Reed, and he smiled. It was the smile of someone who'd just been told they'd lost the game, but they knew they were still the smartest person in the room. Now, if you're like me, you're probably sitting there thinking, why? Why would a kid smile at that? What kind of person does that? This is the story of Lucas Thorne. It's not a simple story about a bad kid who did a terrible thing. It's a story about a brilliant, arrogant teenager who believed, with every fiber of his being, that he was smart enough to get away with murder. He planned it like a school project. He executed it with chilling precision. He thought he was untouchable. This is the story of how that arrogance, that belief in his own perfect intellect, became the very thing that built the walls of his prison. Long before the judge ever said a word. But before we go back to the beginning, to the quiet, rain-soaked nights in Cedar Creek, to the secrets festering behind the closed doors of a perfect-looking home, I want to ask you something. It's important. Where are you right now, listening to this? Are you curled up on your couch, with the rain tapping softly against your window? Or are you in your car, parked somewhere, with the world rushing by outside? Maybe it's the middle of the night where you are, and the only light is the glow from your screen. Wherever you are, whatever the weather, take a second and just feel it. Feel the safety of your space. Because the story we're about to step into, it doesn't have any of that. So, if you're ready to understand the mind of a boy who thought he could outsmart everyone, hit subscribe and let's go. This is going to be a dark one. Okay. Let's go back to that courtroom. The air was so still you could hear the hum of the cheap fluorescent lights overhead. They cast a sickly pale glow on everything, making people look tired and washed out. The room smelled like old wood, stale coffee, and that faint metallic scent of nervous sweat. Lucas sat perfectly still at the defense table. He didn't slump. He didn't fidget. His back was straight, his hands resting calmly on the polished surface. He was wearing a simple, dark blue button-down shirt, the kind his lawyer probably told him would make him look more like a child, less like a killer. But the clothes couldn't hide the sharp, calculating intelligence in his eyes. His mother was sitting right behind him. We'll call her Sarah. Her face was a mask of shattered porcelain, tear-streaked and pale. She kept clutching a wadded-up tissue, her knuckles white. Her whole world had been destroyed twice over. First her husband was murdered, and then her son was the one who'd done it. On the other side of the aisle sat Detective Maria Flores. She was the one who'd pieced it all together. She had her arms crossed, her expression unreadable, but if you looked closely, you could see the tension in her jaw. This wasn't a victory for her. It was just a tragedy that had finally reached its end. And then there was Judge Evelyn Reed. She was a woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes that had seen every kind of human misery this county could produce. She peered down at Lucas over the rims of her glasses, and she wasn't just looking at a teenager. She was looking at a puzzle she'd finally solved. She spent a full 5 minutes explaining her reasoning. She talked about the cold, premeditated nature of the crime, the lack of remorse, the deep-seated narcissism and a dangerous belief in one's own superiority. Lucas listened to it all, his head tilted slightly, as if he were a scientist observing a fascinating experiment. He didn't look at his crying mother. He didn't look at the reporters scribbling furiously in their notepads. His entire focus was on the judge. When she finally said the words, "Life without parole," that's when it happened. The smile. It was so quick, you could have missed it if you blinked. But Detective Flores saw it. I saw it. And in that moment, it was the most terrifying thing in the world. It wasn't the smile of a happy person. It was the smile of someone who's just been proven right in the worst way possible. It was a smile that said, "You think you've contained me, but you haven't. You can't." The bailiffs moved in to lead him away. As they cuffed his hands behind his back, he turned his head, just for a second, and his eyes met Detective Flores's. He gave her a single, slow, almost imperceptible nod. A gesture of respect from one professional to another. Then he was gone, through the side door, into the bowels of the courthouse. The gavel cracked again. The spell was broken. People started talking, crying, gathering their things. But the echo of that smile hung in the air. It was a ghost that would haunt everyone in that room for a long, long time. So how did we get here? How does a 16-year-old boy, a star student, a debater, a son, become a cold-blooded killer who smiles at his own life sentence? It didn't start in a courtroom. It started on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday night, in a quiet house at the end of a cul-de-sac, with a boy who was just too smart for his own good. To understand the end of Lucas Thorne's story, you have to understand the beginning. And the beginning looked perfect. Seriously. If you'd driven down his street in Cedar Creek, Washington, you would have pointed to his house and thought, "Now, that's a nice family." It was a two-story colonial, white with dark blue shutters, tucked under a canopy of ancient pine trees. The lawn was always mowed. The flower beds were always weeded. In the autumn, the air around it smelled like damp earth and wood smoke, the kind of scent you'd find on a candle labeled "Cozy Cabin." And inside that house, every weekday morning at 7:05 a.m., the same scene played out. The kitchen would smell of rich coffee and toasting bread. Lucas would already be at the table, dressed in a clean button-down shirt, his homework laid out neatly beside his plate. He wasn't just a good student. He was the best student. Debate team captain. AP classes. You name it. His father, David Thorne, would be sitting across from him, sipping his black coffee and reading the newspaper. David was a history teacher at the local high school, a well-respected man, with a firm handshake and a calm, measured way of speaking. He was the kind of man who believed in rules, order, and the absolute importance of being correct. On this particular morning, about 6 months before everything went wrong, Lucas was talking about his latest debate topic. "The resolution is about criminal justice reform," Lucas said, his voice bright and engaged. "I'm arguing for the complete overhaul of the parole system. The data on recidivism is just too compelling to ignore." David lowered his newspaper slightly. He didn't smile, but his eyes showed a flicker of pride. This was the son he had raised. A thinker. "It's a strong position," David said, his voice a low rumble. "But remember, Lucas, history teaches us that every system, no matter how flawed, was created for a reason. You have to understand the why before you can argue for the how. You need to cite the Pendleton Act of 1883. It's the foundation." Lucas nodded, absorbing this like a sponge. The Pendleton Act. Right. I'll weave that into my opening statement. It was a normal conversation. A smart son, a knowledgeable father. But if you listen closely, and I mean really listened, you could hear the faintest trace of something else underneath the words. It was in the way David's corrections were always there, just a little too ready. A gentle, constant steering. And it was in the way Lucas accepted them. Not with frustration, but with a calm, almost robotic acceptance. "Of course you're right." After David left for work, Lucas cleared his own plate, washed it in the sink, and placed it perfectly in the drying rack. He walked through the living room, where his mother was arranging a vase of flowers. "Have a good day at school, sweetie," she said, smiling warmly. "You too, Mom," Lucas replied, his tone pleasant but distant, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized long ago. He shouldered his backpack, a bag filled with books on philosophy, advanced physics, and criminal psychology, and stepped outside. The cool, pine-scented air hit his face. He looked back at the perfect house, at the perfect lawn. And for just a second, his face changed. The pleasant, engaged expression from the kitchen melted away. What was left was nothing. A calm, blank slate. His eyes, which had been so bright and attentive moments before, were now as still and dark as the deep water at the edge of the Pacific, just a few miles away. He wasn't angry. He wasn't sad. He was analyzing, observing. He looked at his house not as a home, but as a system. A series of inputs and outputs, of causes and effects. Then he turned and walked toward school, his posture perfect, his steps precise. The model son. The golden boy. Everyone in Cedar Creek saw the shine. But no one stopped to wonder about the incredible pressure it takes to polish something that bright. And no one noticed the tiny, hairline cracks that were already starting to form beneath the surface. Cracks that, very soon, would shatter into a million pieces. Every single one of us has a breaking point. That one thing, that one moment, where something inside us just snaps. For most people, it's something small. A rude comment from a stranger. A bad day at work. But for Lucas Thorne, the breaking point came in the form of a thin, expensive-looking envelope delivered to his perfect house on a Tuesday afternoon. It was from the Caldwell Institute, an elite, early-entrance university program on the East Coast. It was the kind of place that didn't just accept students. It handpicked geniuses. And Lucas had applied in secret. I want you to picture his face when he pulled that letter from the mailbox. The gray Seattle sky was threatening rain, but for Lucas, the sun might as well have been shining. This was it. His ticket out. His validation that he was too big for this small town, too smart for his ordinary life. This was the proof he'd been craving. He didn't open it right away. He carried it inside, up to his immaculate room, and placed it on his desk. He took a breath. And then, with careful hands, he slid a letter opener under the flap. The first word was, "Congratulations." A slow, real smile spread across his face. Not the practiced, polite one he used for his parents or teachers. This was pure, unfiltered triumph. He'd done it. He had beaten the system, jumped the line. While other kids were worrying about finals, he was being invited to join the intellectual elite. For the next few hours, he lived in a bubble of pure, perfect joy. He read the acceptance letter a dozen times. He imagined the lectures, the debates, the kind of people he would finally meet, people who could keep up with him. He decided he would tell his father at dinner. He would present it as the achievement it was. That night, the atmosphere in the dining room was, as always, calm and orderly. The clink of cutlery. The soft hum of the refrigerator. Lucas waited until after his mother had brought out dessert, apple pie, before he slid the letter across the table to his father. "I have some news," Lucas said, his voice steady, but with a current of excitement running underneath it. "I applied to the Caldwell Institute, their early entry program, and I was accepted." His mother's hands flew to her mouth. "Lucas, that's incredible." She looked from Lucas to her husband, her eyes wide with a mixture of pride and shock. David Thorne picked up the letter. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable. He placed it back on the table, neatly beside his plate. He took a sip of water. "No," he said. Just that one, flat word. The air went out of the room. Lucas blinked. "What?" "I said no, Lucas." David's voice was calm, firm, the same tone he used when explaining a historical fact. "You are not going." "But why?" "It's a full scholarship. It's everything we've—" "It's too fast," David interrupted, not unkindly, but with a finality that was like a door slamming shut. "You're 16 years old. You need to be here. You need a normal high school experience. You need to be with kids your own age, not locked in a library with graduate students twice your age." The argument that followed was quiet, but devastating. It wasn't a yelling match. It was a chess game. Lucas used logic, facts, the sheer brilliance of the opportunity. David used a wall of parental concern that was impossible to argue against. "This isn't about what's best for your mind, son," David said, his voice dropping into that gentle, knowing tone that Lucas had come to despise. "This is about what's best for you. As a person. You need more life experience. You need to mature." He looked at his son, and he delivered the final crushing blow. "This is for your own good. One day, you'll thank me for this." And with that, he stood up, took his plate to the kitchen, and walked upstairs, leaving Lucas sitting at the table. The bubble of joy didn't just pop. It shattered into a million sharp, jagged pieces. Lucas didn't move. He didn't cry. He just stared at the empty space where his father had been sitting. His mother tried to speak, to soothe him, but he didn't even hear her. The world had gone silent. He looked down at the acceptance letter. The word, "congratulations," now seemed like a cruel joke. He had never felt more like a prisoner. His father hadn't just rejected a university. He had rejected Lucas's entire mind, his potential, his very self. In that perfect, silent dining room, with the smell of apple pie still hanging in the air, something in Lucas Thorne broke. And in the quiet space where his hope had been, something new and dark and terrifying began to take root. It was no longer about escaping to college. It was about eliminating the obstacle in his way. Permanently. Have you ever had a plan? I'm not talking about a to-do list or what you're making for dinner. I'm talking about a real, intricate, step-by-step plan. The kind that takes over your thoughts, that you run through your head over and over again until every detail is perfect. That's where Lucas was, in the days after his father's refusal. The heartbroken, confused boy from the dinner table was gone. In his place was something else, a cool, collected architect, designing the blueprint for the perfect crime. And the very first brick in that blueprint was the alibi. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't rushed. He approached it like a math problem. If A plus B equals C, then he needed to create an unbreakable equation of where he was supposed to be, so no one would ever question where he actually was. It started at the family dinner table, 2 nights after the Caldwell rejection. The tension in the room was still thick enough to cut with a knife. Lucas pushed his food around his plate, putting on a good show of being a disappointed, sullen teenager. He waited for a lull in the conversation, then he sighed, like he was forcing himself to be responsible. "I have a big study session at the library tonight," he announced, his voice flat. "For the midterm history exam. A bunch of us from the debate team are meeting. It'll probably run late." His mother looked at him, her face soft with sympathy. "Oh, honey. That's good. I'm glad you're focusing on your schoolwork." David Thorne just gave a single, curt nod of approval. This was the kind of behavior he wanted to see. Responsibility. Focusing on the tasks at hand. He had no idea he was just approving step 1 of his own murder. After dinner, Lucas made a performance of packing his backpack. He didn't just throw books in. He was deliberate. He held up his heavy history textbook, making sure his mother saw it. He put in his debate note cards, his binder, a highlighter. He made a show of checking that his laptop charger was in the bag. It was all for them. For their eyes. So later, when the police asked, what was his state of mind, they would say, he was focused on school. He was packing for the library. But here's the thing about a truly brilliant liar. They don't just lie to the people who need to be fooled. They involve the people who will vouch for them. Lucas drove to the library. He walked in, found his friends at their usual table near the periodical section, and he sat down. He pulled out his books. He participated in the study session. For about 45 minutes, he was just Lucas, the good student. And then, he executed phase 2. He let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. He let his shoulders slump. He made sure his friend, Chloe, who was sitting right next to him, noticed. "You okay, Lucas?" she asked. He gave her a tired, weak smile. "Yeah. Just a massive headache coming on. I think I need to go home and just lie down." He was so good at it. He sounded genuinely worn out. He even squinted a little, like the fluorescent lights were hurting his eyes. "Oh, no. Do you want me to drive you?" Chloe asked, full of concern. No. I'll be fine," he said, holding up a hand. "I just need to sleep it off. You guys keep going. I'll text you if I need the notes." He packed his bag slowly, deliberately. He made sure they all saw him leave. He walked out the main doors of the library, got into his car, and drove away. And in their minds, he was gone. Lucas went home sick. That was the story. That was the fact. But he didn't drive home. He drove to a 24-hour convenience store on the edge of town, a place with no security cameras in the parking lot. He parked around back, in the shadows. And he waited. He sat there in the dark, the only sound the hum of the car's engine and the beat of his own heart. He wasn't nervous. He was rehearsing, going over the next steps in his mind. The timing, the actions. He had just built a cage of lies, and every person he loved was now a lock, holding the door shut for him. His parents thought he was at the library. His friends thought he was home sick. He was a ghost, officially nowhere, which was the only place he could be to get away with what happened next. There's a sound we all know. The sharp, shocking, almost musical crash of glass breaking. It's a sound that makes you jump. It means something is wrong. Something has been violated. That sound was the starter's pistol for Lucas Thorne. He sat in his car behind the convenience store until the digital clock on his dashboard glowed 9 p.m. The library would be closing soon. His alibi was ticking along perfectly. It was time. He drove the familiar streets, but he didn't go to his own house. Not yet. He drove to the quiet, dark park 2 blocks over. He killed the engine and got out. The night air was cool and damp, typical for Washington, smelling of wet pine needles and distant chimney smoke. He didn't look around. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight to the decorative rock garden near the playground, selected a single, heavy, fist-sized stone, and slipped it into the pocket of his dark hoodie. It was a practical choice. Impersonal. Just a tool. The walk back to his own street felt endless, yet it was over in a heartbeat. His house came into view. It looked peaceful. A light was on in his parents' bedroom upstairs. Another glowed from his father's study at the back of the house. The perfect, silent stage. He circled around to the backyard, his movements smooth and silent on the damp grass. He stood there for a moment, looking at the back door. This was the moment of no return. And then he threw the rock. It wasn't a frantic, wild throw. It was calculated, aimed. The window pane in the back door exploded inward with a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet night. 1,000 glittering shards rained down onto the kitchen floor. Inside the house, everything was still for 1, 2, 3 seconds. Then, a voice from upstairs. His mother. "David." What was that? A floorboard creaked overhead. Then, the study door opened. His father appeared at the end of the hallway, his silhouette framed by the light behind him. "Stay upstairs, Sarah." David Thorne called out, his voice tight with alarm. Probably just a raccoon knocking over the garbage cans. Lucas, hidden in the shadows of the backyard, watched his father approach the kitchen. He saw him stop, stare at the broken glass, and let out a frustrated sigh. Perfect. He was taking the bait. David, ever the practical man, stepped carefully into the kitchen, his shoes crunching on the glass. He was looking down, surveying the damage, probably already thinking about the cost of a new window pane. He never saw his son step out of the shadows and into the doorway behind him. Lucas didn't say a word. There was no dramatic speech. No, this is for ruining my life. This wasn't about emotion for him. It was about logistics. It was the next step in the equation. In his hand, he held another one of his father's things. A heavy, bronze bookend from the study, shaped like an eagle. It was solid, efficient. He raised it, and he brought it down. The sound wasn't like the movies. It was a dull, wet, terribly final thud. David Thorne collapsed without a sound. He just folded. A puppet with its strings cut. Lucas stood over his father's body, breathing normally. He felt nothing. No panic. No guilt. No triumph. He felt the way you might feel after finally fixing a broken appliance. A sense of a problem solved. Now, for the final, brilliant touch. He stepped over his father, walked into the study, and went straight to the desk. To the expensive, heavy fountain pen that was always there, his father's favorite. He picked it up. He carried it back to the kitchen. He knelt beside his father's body, avoiding the small, dark pool of blood beginning to form around his head. With the care of a museum curator, he placed the clean, shiny fountain pen on the floor, just inches from his father's outstretched hand. It was the masterstroke. The detail that would scream, struggle. A desperate father, fighting off an intruder, grabbing the nearest heavy object. It was perfect. He stood up. He took one last, long look at the scene. The broken glass. The staged struggle. The body. The pen. It was all exactly as he had designed it in his mind. Then, he turned and walked back out the broken door, melting into the dark, damp night as quietly as he had come. The whole thing, from the sound of the breaking glass to his final exit, took less than 90 seconds. Inside the house, upstairs, his mother was calling out, her voice trembling now. "David? David, are you okay?" But the only answer was the silent, spreading dark on the kitchen floor, and the gleam of a perfectly clean and used fountain pen, waiting to tell its lie to the police. After the sound of breaking glass, after the terrible silence, what comes next? For most of us, it's panic. It's screaming. It's fumbling with a phone, fingers shaking so badly you can barely dial. But Lucas Thorne wasn't most of us. He walked away from his house, from the body of his father in the kitchen, and he didn't run. He walked. Calmly. Deliberately. He had one more role to play, and it required the performance of a lifetime. He got back into his car and drove to a part of town that was mostly closed up for the night. He pulled into the lot of a closed-down laundromat, its windows dark and dusty. And there, tucked in the corner, was his prop, an old, grimy payphone. A relic. Something that couldn't be traced directly back to him. He took a deep breath. He closed his eyes for a second. And when he opened them, he wasn't Lucas Thorne, the cold and calculating architect of a murder. He was Lucas Thorne, the terrified, panicked son. He picked up the receiver. The metal was cold in his hand. He dialed 911. A dispatcher's voice, calm and professional, came on the line. 911, what is your emergency? And then, Lucas unleashed his performance. His voice came out in a frantic, breathless rush. It was pitched high with fear. He was almost hyperventilating. Please. You have to send someone. I think someone broke into my house. Okay, son, slow down. What's your address? He gave his address, his words tumbling over each other. I just got home from the library and the back door. The window is all broken. And I can hear my mom screaming upstairs. Oh God, please, my dad's in there. He's in there. He was panting now, the perfect sound of someone running while on the phone. I'm hiding outside. I'm too scared to go in. Just please, send someone. Hurry. The dispatcher tried to keep him on the line. Stay on the phone with me, okay? Help is on the way. But Lucas knew when to exit stage left. I see headlights. Is that you? I'm waving. Please, just help my family. And with a final, choked sob, he hung up. The line went dead. He stood there for a moment in the silent phone booth, his breathing already returning to normal. The transition was jarring. 1 second, he was a sobbing, terrified boy. The next, his face was a blank, calm slate again. He had done his job. The police were now on their way to discover the scene he had created. But the performance wasn't over. Not even close. He got back in his car and drove. Not home. Not to the scene of the crime. He drove back to the library. He parked, took another deep breath, and once again, slipped the mask back on. His shoulders slumped. His face took on a pale, weary expression. He walked back through the library's automatic doors just as his friends were packing up their books. Chloe saw him first. Lucas, I thought you went home. Are you okay? He ran a hand through his hair, making it look slightly messy. I tried. I was almost home when I started feeling a little better. Didn't want to miss out on studying for the final section. He managed a weak, shaky smile. The power of ibuprofen, I guess. It was a flawless lie. Believable. Relatable. And then, right on cue, they all heard it. The distant, but unmistakable, wail of police sirens. First one, then another, growing louder, cutting through the quiet night. Everyone in the library looked up, intrigued. Lucas did something brilliant then. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a concerned whisper. Whoa, that sounds close. That's near my neighborhood. He let the worry creep onto his face. He pulled out his phone, pretending to check it. My mom hasn't texted me back. He was painting a picture for them, stroke by stroke. The worried son. The concerned neighbor. He was building his alibi not just with words, but with reactions. He was making them witnesses to his innocence. When he finally said, "You know what, guys, I'm just gonna head home and make sure everything's okay," it was the most natural thing in the world. They all nodded, telling him to be safe, to text them. He walked out of the library, back into the night, the sirens now a screaming chorus in the distance. He was driving directly toward the chaos he had created. He was no longer just the killer. He was now the first responder. The grieving son, arriving home to a nightmare. The stage was set. The actors were in place. And Lucas Thorne was ready to play the part of a lifetime. You ever put together a piece of furniture from one of those flat-pack boxes? And you're following the instructions, and you're sure you've got it right, but there's one screw left over. One tiny, little screw. And you look at the chair, and it seems fine. It looks perfect. But deep down, that one missing piece means the whole thing is weaker than it should be. It's flawed. Lucas Thorne's perfect crime had a screw left over. Her name was Detective Maria Flores. She arrived at the Thorne house 10 minutes after the first patrol cars. The place was a whirlwind of flashing red and blue lights, of radio static and young officers trying to look professional while hiding their own unease. The air was cold, and the broken window in the back door looked like a black, gaping mouth. Flores was a woman in her 40s, with dark hair pulled into a tight bun and eyes that had seen too much. She didn't rush. She stood at the edge of the chaos for a moment, just watching, taking it all in. Her job wasn't just to see what was there, but to see what wasn't, to feel what was wrong. And something here was wrong. She stepped inside, her shoes crunching on the glass. She saw David Thorne's body, the blood, the staged disarray. She saw Lucas, the picture of devastation, being comforted by his mother on the stairs. She saw it all. And her internal alarm started ringing, soft but persistent. The first thing that bothered her was the broken window. The glass was all on the inside. That meant the break was made from the outside, sure. But the way it was shattered, it was too neat. A single, clean hole. Not the wild, multiple strikes you'd expect from a panicked burglar. Then, the stolen items. A laptop was left open on the desk in the study. A wallet was on the counter. But a silver picture frame and an old iPod were gone. It was a weird selection. It felt symbolic. Like someone was checking boxes on a list of what a burglary should look like. But the real screw, the one that didn't fit, was the fountain pen. Flores knelt by the body. She didn't touch anything. She just looked. David Thorne was a big man. If there had been a struggle, it would have been violent, messy. The pen was right there, near his hand. The story it was supposed to tell was obvious. He fought back. He grabbed this to defend himself. But the pen was perfect. It was a heavy, expensive pen. The kind that would show every scratch, every fingerprint, every smear in a real fight. But this one, it was pristine, shiny, clean. It looked like it had just been polished and set down for display. There were no frantic scratch marks on the floor from a struggle. No blood on the pen. No fingerprints. Nothing. It was placed. Not dropped. Not used. It was a prop. In that moment, Detective Flores knew. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This was a performance. And the person who staged it was smart, but they were also arrogant. They thought they knew what a crime scene should look like. They thought they could outsmart everyone by following the script. But they didn't account for the messy, illogical details of real life. Real panic doesn't stage things perfectly. Real struggle doesn't leave a clean, shiny pen on the floor. She stood up and her eyes drifted across the room, past the sobbing mother, and landed on Lucas. He was watching her. And for a split second, before he could put the mask of the grieving son back on, she saw it in his eyes. Not grief, not fear, but a cold, calculating curiosity. He was watching the detective, the way a student watches a teacher, waiting to see if she'd pass the test. And in that silent exchange, the game began. The perfect crime was flawed. And Detective Flores had just found the crack. So what do you think? Did Lucas make a mistake with that pen, or was there something else that gave him away? What would you be looking for if you were Detective Flores? Drop your theory in the comments right now. You can train a police dog to sniff out drugs. You can teach an officer to read fingerprints. But spotting a liar? That's an art. And Detective Maria Flores was a master artist. 2 days after the murder, she invited Lucas and his mother down to the station. Not for a harsh interrogation under a blinding light. No, that was for TV. This was something much more subtle and much more dangerous for Lucas. She called it a conversation. A chance to go over the timeline. She wanted him in a controlled environment, away from the chaos of the crime scene. She wanted to see how he behaved when he had to build his story from the ground up. She sat across from him in a small, quiet room that smelled like stale coffee and lemon-scented cleaner. Lucas looked pale and tired, which was exactly how a grieving son should look. His mother sat beside him, clutching a tissue. "Lucas," Flores began, her voice soft and friendly. "I know this is hard. I just want to go over that night one more time. In your own words. Start from when you left the library the first time." And so, he began. And his performance was flawless. On the surface, he talked about feeling sick, the headache, the decision to go home. He described the moment he pulled up to the house and saw the broken glass, the fear he felt, calling 911 from his hiding spot. His words were perfect. His timeline was consistent. But Flores wasn't listening to his words. Not really. She was listening to the music underneath them. And the music was all wrong. First, there was the language. When he described his father, he didn't say, "my dad," or "my father." He used his name. "I was worried about David. I thought David might be hurt." It was distant, formal, like he was talking about a character in a book, not the man who raised him. Then, there was the emotion. When he got to the part about finding out his father was dead, his voice would crack, and he'd look down at the table. But it felt rehearsed, like an actor hitting his mark. There were no real tears. His eyes, when he looked up, were dry and clear. There was no redness, no puffiness. The grief was all in the audio, with no visual proof. Flores leaned forward slightly, her tone still gentle. "Lucas, can you tell me about your relationship with your father?" He didn't miss a beat. It was good. He was strict, but he wanted what was best for me. We debated sometimes. About history, politics. He was very smart. "Debated?" Flores asked, tilting her head. "What about?" "Everything," Lucas said, and for the first time, a flicker of something real crossed his face. Not sadness. Annoyance. The correct way to analyze the Peloponnesian War. The economic policies of the 1980s. He always had to have the last word. He always had to be right. There it was. The first tiny crack. Flores just nodded, making a note. She didn't press it. She let the silence hang in the air for a moment, a technique that makes most people nervous, making them rush to fill the quiet. Lucas just sat there, perfectly calm. So, she changed tack. The 911 call you made was very articulate, even though you were so scared. You gave the address clearly. You described the situation. That was very brave. It was a test. A compliment designed to see his ego. Lucas almost smiled. A tiny, proud twitch of the lips. I guess debate training kicks in, even under pressure. You learn to organize your thoughts quickly. Bingo. A truly grieving person wouldn't feel pride in that moment. They'd feel shame for being too scared to go inside. They'd feel guilt. But Lucas, he was taking a compliment on his technique. After 45 minutes, Flores ended the interview. She thanked them, offered her condolences again, and watched them leave. She went straight back to her desk, plugged her headphones into the digital recorder, and listened to the interview again. And then a third time. She closed her eyes, blocking out everything but his voice. And she heard it, clear as day. The human lie detector going off in her head. The lack of stuttering. The precise, analytical language. The complete absence of what she called emotional leakage. Those raw, unguarded sounds of true grief that you can't fake. When he described his father's death, it was with the detached interest of a scientist describing a lab result. He was a calculator trying to mimic a heart. He hadn't slipped up. He hadn't contradicted himself. But he had shown her exactly who he was. A brilliant, cold, and utterly narcissistic young man who was more concerned with the elegance of his story than the death of his father. The evidence wasn't there yet. But the target was now locked in her sights. Lucas Thorne was lying. And Detective Flores was now absolutely certain she was looking at David Thorne's killer. You live in the digital world, right? We all do. Your phone, your laptop, your social media. It's all a diary of who you are. Your likes, your searches, your private messages. It's the first place any detective looks. And it was the first place Detective Flores looked for Lucas Thorne. She had her tech team pull everything. His personal cell phone records. His home computer. His social media DMs. They dug through his digital life like archaeologists, looking for a shred of motive, a hint of planning, a secret message to a friend. And they found nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was cleaner than a hospital room. No suspicious searches for how to stage a burglary or how to crack a skull. No deleted files. No incriminating texts. His browser history was all debate forums, university websites, and physics tutorials. His messages were about homework and movie plans. It was like a digital ghost had committed this murder. Lucas was too smart for the obvious stuff. He knew they'd look at his personal devices. So he'd never used them. He'd done his research the old-fashioned way, in library books probably, read in corners where no security camera could see him. He was a phantom. Flores sat in her office, staring at the report. The Lucas Thorne is a perfect angel report. It was frustrating. She knew he was guilty. She could feel it in her bones. But knowing and proving are two very different things. She needed another angle. A different door to kick down. And then, she remembered something from that first interview. The way he'd puffed up with pride when she mentioned his debate skills. His intellect was his identity. It was his currency. It was also, she suspected, his biggest weakness. She picked up the phone and called the principal of Cedar Creek High School. "Hi, it's Detective Flores again. I need a favor. I need you to give me Lucas Thorne's school-issued laptop." There was a pause on the other end. His school laptop? But his personal devices were already cleared. "I know," Flores said calmly. "This is different. Just have it brought to the front office. I'll be there in 10 minutes. She hung up. This was a hunch. A long shot. But the best detectives play their hunches. An hour later, the cheap, silver school laptop was on a tech analyst's desk. The analyst, a young guy named Ben, looked skeptical. "This thing is a brick, detective. It can barely run educational software." "What are we looking for?" I don't know, Flores admitted. But his whole life was that school. His identity was being the smartest kid in the room. Look for anything related to his debates, his essays, his projects. Ben started digging. And just like with the personal devices, it seemed clean at first. Filled with homework assignments, PowerPoint presentations, and PDFs of classic novels. But then Ben opened a folder simply titled Debate Regionals. Inside were dozens of files. Research notes, speech drafts, and one file, larger than the others, called Final Argument, Criminal Justice Reform. Flores leaned over his shoulder. Open that one. Ben clicked it open. It was a Word document. A beautifully written, meticulously sourced essay arguing for the overhaul of the parole system. It talked about the fallibility of evidence, the psychology of criminals, the flaws in police procedure. And then, Flores saw it. She pointed a finger at the screen, her heart starting to beat a little faster. Read that paragraph. Out loud. Ben cleared his throat. And the most common error in homicide investigations is the misreading of staged crime scenes. A perpetrator with a basic understanding of forensic countermeasures can easily manipulate the evidence to suggest a narrative of a random burglary or a crime of passion. The key is to create a plausible story for the authorities, using known facts about human behavior under duress. The room went quiet. Flores scrolled down, her eyes scanning the text. Another section leaped out. The selection of a weapon of opportunity is critical. It must be an item indigenous to the location, but its placement must tell the story of a struggle. However, overstaging is a frequent mistake. The item must show signs of use, fingerprints, smudges, blood transfer. A perfectly clean item is a red flag. A perfectly clean item. Like a fountain pen. Lucas hadn't been stupid enough to search for this on his personal computer. He'd written it all down, hiding it in plain sight. In a school assignment he was probably getting an A+ on. This wasn't a random essay. This was his manifesto. His blueprint. He'd been so arrogant, so convinced of his own superiority, that he'd used his school project as a notebook for planning the perfect murder. He thought no one would ever think to look here, or that if they did, they'd just see a brilliant student's work. And he was almost right. Flores printed the entire document. She held the warm pages in her hands. This was it. This was the crack in the digital ghost's armor. It wasn't a smoking gun, not yet. But it was a map. A map straight into the mind of a killer who was so proud of his own intelligence. He'd practically written them a confession and turned it in for a grade. You know how it is when you're absolutely sure of something? Like, 100%, cross your heart sure? You'd bet your life on it. That's how Chloe felt about Lucas's alibi. She was his friend from the debate team. Smart, observant, and fiercely loyal. When Detective Flores asked to speak with her, Chloe was ready for a fight. She sat in the same quiet interview room, her arms crossed, a defensive look on her face. She was there to protect her friend. "Chloe," Flores began, her voice warm and non-threatening. "I just want to go over that night at the library one more time. You were studying with Lucas, right?" "Yes," Chloe said, her tone firm. "He was there the whole time. Until he left because he had a headache." "And what time was that? When he left?" "It was around 7:45? Maybe 7:50? I remember because we just finished the section on economic policy." Flores nodded, making a note. "And when did he come back?" "He came back about 25 minutes later. He said his headache was a little better and he didn't want to miss studying for the history section." "And how did he seem when he came back?" "Tired. A little pale. But he said he was fine. He said it was just the power of ibuprofen." Chloe leaned forward, her eyes earnest. "He was totally normal. We all saw him. He was there when we heard the sirens. He was worried about his neighborhood. It was a solid, unwavering story. The kind that would hold up in any courtroom." Flores could see the wall of certainty around Chloe. She wasn't lying. She truly believed every word she was saying. So, Flores didn't try to break the wall. She just started looking for a loose brick. "I believe you, Chloe," Flores said softly. "I do. This must be really hard for you and your friends." Some of the tension left Chloe's shoulders. "It is. Lucas is a good person. He's going through hell." "I know," Flores said, her voice full of sympathy. She paused, looking down at her notes as if trying to piece something together. "It's just the timeline that's a little tricky for us. We're trying to account for every minute, to rule things out, you know? So, just to be super clear, when Lucas left at 7:45, he was gone for a solid 20 minutes, you said?" "Yeah, about that." "And during that time, you didn't see him or hear from him?" "No. He went home." Flores tapped her pencil lightly on the table. A thoughtful tap, tap, tap. "You know, it's funny. The brain works in weird ways when you're stressed. Sometimes, later on, little details pop up that you didn't think were important at the time." She looked directly at Chloe, her gaze gentle but intent. "Is there anything else from that night? Anything at all, no matter how small, that stuck with you? Maybe something you didn't mention before?" Chloe was quiet for a long moment. She uncrossed her arms and looked down at her hands. The defensive wall was still there, but now there was a tiny crack of doubt. Flores's question had planted a seed. Chloe started, then stopped. She frowned. "It's probably nothing." "Nothing is nothing until we know what it is," Flores said calmly. "Please." Chloe took a deep breath. "It's just, when Lucas came back, his hair was a little damp, like from the mist outside. And I remember thinking it was weird, because when he left, it wasn't raining. It was just cold." Flores didn't react. She just kept her kind, attentive expression. "Okay. What else?" "And," Chloe's voice dropped to a near whisper, "when he sat down next to me, I caught a smell. Just for a second. It wasn't his usual smell. It was like cold air and, I don't know, dirt? Like wet earth. I thought maybe he'd walked through the garden at his house or something when he went to get the ibuprofen. Cold air and wet earth. Not the smell of a warm house and a medicine cabinet." Flores felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. She saw it. The 20-minute window. Just enough time to drive to the park, get the rock, walk home, smash the window, commit the murder, stage the scene, drive to the payphone, make the call, and drive back to the library. "You're doing the right thing, Chloe," Flores said softly. "This is very helpful." The interview ended. Chloe left the station, her certainty now shaken, the memory of that strange earthy smell haunting her. Flores went back to her desk. She looked at the timeline she'd drawn up. The 20-minute gap that Chloe had just confirmed. It was the final piece. It wasn't proof, not on its own. But it was the frame that held all the other pieces together. The damp hair, the smell of dirt, the proud essay, the clean pen. It all fit. Lucas Thorne hadn't been home sick. He'd been busy. And his best alibi had just, without even realizing it, given Detective Flores the exact time frame of the murder. Have you ever met someone who's just so in love with the sound of their own voice? Someone who can't resist showing you how smart they are? That's a dangerous person to be. Because that need, that hunger for admiration, is a trap waiting to be sprung. Detective Maria Flores was about to set that trap for Lucas Thorne. She called him and his mother back to the station. But this time, the feeling was different. She wasn't the gentle, sympathetic detective anymore. She was a chess player, and she was about to make her move. She sat across from Lucas in the same gray room. But this time, she had a thin folder on the table in front of her. Inside was his debate essay. She hadn't arrested him yet. She didn't have enough for that. What she needed was a confession. And to get that, she needed him to feel safe. She needed him to feel superior. "Lucas," she began, leaning back in her chair, a look of professional respect on her face. "I've got to be honest with you. This case, It's a puzzle. And I'm stuck. Lucas watched her, his eyes sharp and attentive. He said nothing. We've hit a wall with the burglary angle, Flores continued, spreading her hands in a gesture of frustration. It just doesn't add up. The way the scene was staged, it's too clever. This wasn't some random junkie. This was someone who knew what they were doing. Someone smart. She saw it. The tiniest flicker of interest in his eyes. A predator hearing its favorite tune. So, Flores said, leaning forward and tapping the folder. I've been looking at you. Your record. Your achievements. And I read this. She opened the folder and slid the debate essay, his essay, across the table. This is brilliant work, Lucas. Truly. The insight into criminal psychology. It's better than some of the profiles I see from the FBI. Lucas's eyes dropped to the paper. A slow, proud smile touched his lips. He tried to hide it, but he couldn't. This was what he lived for. Recognition. Thank you, he said, his voice calm, but she could hear the pleasure underneath. I mean it, Flores pressed, her voice full of genuine-sounding awe. The section on staged crime scenes? The part about the weapon of opportunity? I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've never seen it laid out so clearly. You have a real gift for understanding how criminals think. And that was the bait. The shiny, irresistible bait for his enormous ego. Lucas took it. He couldn't help himself. It's really just about logic, he said, his posture relaxing. He was no longer the grieving son. He was the expert lecturer. Most criminals are emotional. They panic. They make mistakes. But a truly logical mind, it sees the situation as a series of problems to be solved. Evidence is just a variable. The crime scene is an equation. You just have to balance it. Flores nodded along, playing the perfect student. Fascinating. So, in a theoretical situation, if someone were to, say, stage a burglary, what would be the most common mistake? Lucas didn't even hesitate. He was in his element. Overcomplication, he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Amateurs add too many details. They think more mess looks more real. But real crime is often sloppy and simple. The key is subtlety. A single, telling detail placed correctly is more powerful than a room full of overturned furniture. Like a perfectly clean fountain pen? Flores asked, her tone light, curious. Lucas's smile widened. Just a fraction. Exactly. An item like that, in the midst of a supposed struggle, should show transfer. Fingerprints, fibers, blood. If it's clean. He shrugged, as if the conclusion was child's play. It was placed, not used. It's a prop. Only someone with a basic understanding of forensics would make that error. Flores felt a cold thrill run down her spine. He was so close. He was practically confessing, wrapped in a blanket of his own intellectual superiority. She decided to push one step further. And the alibi? What's the flaw in a perfect alibi? The flaw is that it's perfect, Lucas said, a hint of condescension in his voice now. Nothing in life is perfect. A perfect alibi is constructed. It's a story. The weakness is in the seams. The tiny, unaccounted-for moments. A 20-minute gap, for example. Enough time for a determined person to do almost anything. The room went silent. He had walked right into the trap. He'd referenced the clean pen. He'd referenced the 20-minute gap. He was showing off, proving he was smarter than the hypothetical killer, smarter than the police. He was detailing his own crime and calling it theory. Flores let the silence hang. She didn't look triumphant. She just looked at him, and her expression slowly changed. The respect and curiosity melted away, replaced by a flat, knowing calm. Lucas saw the change. The lecture hall atmosphere vanished. The smug look on his face froze, then slowly dissolved into confusion, and then, for the first time, a sliver of doubt. He had been performing for an audience of one, And he just realized that the audience wasn't there to learn. She was there to collect. Flores slowly closed the folder containing his essay. "Thank you, Lucas," she said, her voice now quiet and final. That was all very educational. She had what she needed. Not a confession, not yet. But she had a recording of him analyzing his own perfect crime, pointing out its flaws with the proud detachment of a master sculptor critiquing his own work. His arrogance had built the trap. And he had just sprung it himself. Just when you think you have the whole picture, life throws a curveball. Detective Flores thought she had Lucas Thorne figured out. A narcissistic genius who killed his controlling father to get out from under his thumb. It was a clean, cold, logical motive. But the truth? The truth is never that simple. And it's almost never that cold. Flores was at her desk, the recording of Lucas's arrogant lecture still ringing in her ears. She was building her case, piece by piece. The essay. The 20-minute gap. The fountain pen. It was all circumstantial, but it was strong. She was preparing to go to the district attorney, to finally get an arrest warrant. And then her phone rang. It was an out-of-state number. Area code for Oregon. She almost didn't answer it. But something made her pick up. Detective Flores. The voice on the other end was a man's, deep and thick with an emotion she couldn't quite place. Not quite grief. Not quite anger. It was regret. Speaking. "Who is this?" "This is Mark Thorne." David was. "He was my brother." Flores sat up straighter. Lucas's uncle. She'd tried to contact him early on, but he'd been traveling for work. "Mr. Thorne, I'm so sorry for your loss. What can I do for you?" There was a long pause on the line, filled only by the sound of his breathing. He was gathering himself. "I've been avoiding this call," he finally said, his voice cracking. "I didn't know what to do. But I saw the news. I saw they haven't caught anyone. I can't live with this." "Live with what, Mark?" Flores asked, her detective senses screaming that whatever this was, it was big. "The secret," he whispered. "My brother made me swear not to tell anyone. Especially not Lucas." Flores picked up a pen, ready to take notes. "Tell me." "David, he was sick, detective. Really sick. It wasn't something you could see." Mark took a shaky breath. He had a rare, degenerative neurological disease. It's called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. It's always fatal. Fast. And brutal. The pen in Flores's hand stopped moving. The air seemed to leave the room. "He was diagnosed 6 months ago," Mark continued, the words now pouring out in a torrent of pain. "The doctors gave him a year, at most. Maybe only a few months. He was already starting to have lapses, moments of confusion, trouble finding words. He was terrified of what was coming, of losing his mind." Flores closed her eyes. She could see it now. The pieces were rearranging themselves in her head, forming a completely new and infinitely more tragic picture. "He didn't want Lucas to know," Mark said, his voice breaking. "He didn't want his son's last memories of him to be of that. Of him deteriorating. He wanted Lucas to remember him as the strong, smart father he'd always been. He thought he was protecting him." "The university," Flores said softly, almost to herself. "The early entry program. Lucas was accepted." On the other end of the line, Mark let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh of pure anguish. "That's the sickest part of all of this, detective. David was so excited for him. He was so proud. He told me all about it. But he was also devastated. He knew he only had a little time left. He was being selfish, yes. But it was the selfishness of a dying man who wanted every single second he could get with his boy. He refused to sign the forms because he wanted Lucas home. For the little time he had left. The truth landed on Detective Flores like a physical weight. It wasn't about control. It was about love. A desperate, flawed, terrified love. Lucas hadn't killed a tyrant. He'd killed a desperate, dying man who loved him so much he was willing to let his son hate him, just to have him near for a few more months. He had constructed this brilliant, perfect murder to escape a prison that didn't exist. The walls he thought were cold, hard control were actually the crumbling, fragile walls of his father's love, built to shield him from a horrible truth. The arrogance, the coldness, the absolute conviction that he was right. It all came crashing down under the weight of this new, terrible understanding. Lucas Thorne wasn't just a murderer. He was the tragic, arrogant fool who had killed the one person who was trying, in the only way he knew how, to save them both from a different kind of death. "Do you understand what this means, detective?" Mark asked, his voice hollow. Flores looked down at the file on her desk. At the picture of Lucas, so calm and superior. At the essay he was so proud of. "Yes, Mark," she said, her own voice quiet with the horror of it. "I understand." It meant Lucas's entire motive was a lie. His perfect, logical crime was built on a foundation of catastrophic, heartbreaking error. And it meant that when he found out, the collapse of his brilliant, arrogant world would be more devastating than any life sentence a judge could ever give him. There's a moment right before a storm hits when the air goes completely still. The birds stop singing. The world holds its breath. That's what the hallways of Cedar Creek High School felt like right before Detective Flores arrived. It was just after the lunch bell. Students were laughing, shoving books into lockers, making plans for the weekend. The air smelled like old French fries and cleaning spray. Normal, boring, everyday life. Lucas was at his locker, spinning the combination lock with his usual, precise movements. He was the picture of calm. The golden boy, back in his natural habitat. He had no idea the storm was already in the parking lot. Detective Flores didn't come in with sirens blazing. She walked in with two uniformed officers, their footsteps echoing too loudly on the linoleum floor. The principal, a nervous man with a sweating forehead, led the way. The chatter in the hallways dipped, then died completely. You could hear a pin drop. Every kid in that hallway stopped what they were doing. They were a sea of frozen faces, watching the adults walk with a grim, unstoppable purpose. They stopped at Lucas's locker. He turned, and when he saw Flores, his expression didn't change to fear or panic. It changed to recognition. Like a chess master who sees the final, inevitable move has been played. "Lucas Thorne," Flores said. Her voice was flat, official, cutting through the silence. It wasn't the friendly tone from the interviews. This was the voice of the law. "You are under arrest for the murder of David Thorne." A collective gasp rippled through the hallway. Someone dropped a textbook. The sound was like a gunshot. Lucas just stood there. He didn't look at his gawking classmates. He didn't look at the panicked principal. His entire focus was on Detective Flores. He was analyzing her, studying her. The uniformed officers moved in. One of them gently took his arm. "You need to turn around and place your hands behind your back, son." That's when they did it. They handcuffed him. Right there in the hallway, in front of everyone. The metallic click of the cuffs locking into place was the most final, most terrifying sound any of those kids had ever heard. This wasn't a TV show. This was real. The smartest kid they knew, the one who was supposed to go on to do great things, was being arrested for killing his own father. As they started to lead him away, Lucas paused. He turned his head, his body already in the control of the officers, and his eyes found Flores's one more time. And he spoke. His voice was calm, clear. It didn't sound like the voice of a scared teenager. And he spoke. His voice was calm, clear. It didn't sound like the voice of a scared teenager. It sounded like one professional giving a rating to another. "You're better than I thought," he said. No anger. No pleading. Just a simple, clinical assessment. Then he turned and walked with them, his head held high, as if he were leading the procession. The spell was broken. The second the main doors swung shut behind him, the hallway exploded into a chaos of whispers and frantic phone calls. The perfect, orderly world of Cedar Creek High had just been shattered. Outside, the sky had turned a bruised gray. A light, cold drizzle had started to fall. Flores watched as the officers guided Lucas into the back of the patrol car. He didn't struggle. He didn't look back at the school. He just sat in the plastic seat, staring straight ahead through the metal mesh, his face a mask of calm acceptance. As the car pulled away, its tires hissing on the wet asphalt, Flores felt no sense of victory. No celebration. She just felt the heavy, cold weight of the truth she now carried. She had her killer. The case was, for all intents and purposes, solved. But as she stood there in the rain, all she could think about was the secret she now knew. The tragic, horrible truth that Lucas had no idea about. She looked at the patrol car disappearing down the road, taking the boy who thought he was a genius to his new, small, concrete world. And she knew. The arrest wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of the real tragedy. A courtroom is a stage. And a trial, it's the ultimate performance. The lawyers are the directors. The jury is the audience. And the defendant is usually the star, sitting there quietly, hoping their lawyer's script is good enough to save them. But Lucas Thorne had never been one to follow someone else's script. His lawyer, a weary public defender named Alan Krauss, had begged him, "Lucas, do not take the stand. Do you hear me? The prosecution will tear you apart. They have the essay, the timeline, the pen. Your calmness will look like coldness to the jury. Let me handle this." Lucas had listened to this advice with a polite, distant expression. The same expression he'd used with his father. And he had dismissed it just as easily. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that he was the smartest person in the room. Smarter than his lawyer. Smarter than the prosecutor. Definitely smarter than the 12 ordinary people sitting in the jury box. How could he possibly leave his fate in their hands? He had to control the narrative. He had to show them his genius. So, against all advice, Lucas Thorne took the stand. He was a mesmerizing witness. He sat up straight, dressed in a simple, dark suit. He made direct eye contact with the jurors. He spoke in that clear, articulate voice, using perfect grammar. He was the picture of a rational, intelligent young man caught in a terrible misunderstanding. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Angela Rossi, started with the obvious. "Mr. Thorne, did you kill your father?" "No, I did not," Lucas said, his voice steady and sincere. She pressed him on the alibi, the 20-minute gap. Lucas was ready. He explained it with flawless, cold logic. The human experience of time under stress is subjective. What felt like 20 minutes of fear and confusion could have been far less. My perception was compromised. He was so calm, so reasonable. It was chilling. Then, Rossi brought up the fountain pen. "Can you explain why a pen from your father's study was found on the floor, perfectly clean, if there was a violent struggle?" Lucas didn't even blink. "I can't explain the actions of the intruder. Perhaps he dropped it. Perhaps my father never got a chance to use it. Its cleanliness proves nothing, other than that it wasn't used. He was good. He was so good." He was dismantling the state's case point by point, not with emotion, but with pure, unassailable intellect. He was playing 4D chess while everyone else was playing checkers. He even turned the debate essay back on them. "That paper was an academic exercise," he explained, looking right at the jury. "It was an exploration of theoretical flaws in a system. It's the height of irony that my own intellectual curiosity is being used as a weapon against me." You could see a few jurors nodding. He was winning them over. He was making them see the world through his brilliant, logical eyes. His own lawyer, Krauss, watched from the defense table with a sense of dread. He knew what was coming. He could feel it in his bones. Lucas was setting a trap for himself, and he was too arrogant to see it. He was creating a perfect, logical castle. But castles built on arrogance have very weak foundations. Finally, the prosecutor changed her tone. She became almost conversational. "Lucas, let's talk about your father. Why would someone want to kill him?" This was Lucas's moment. This was the monologue he'd been waiting to deliver. He leaned slightly into the microphone, his eyes sweeping over the jury. My father was a man who demanded control, he began, his voice taking on a rehearsed, dramatic quality. He saw my mind not as a gift, but as his own creation. A project to be managed. His refusal to let me attend the Caldwell Institute wasn't about protection. It was about possession. He was a gatekeeper, standing between me and my destiny. He went on, painting a picture of a cold, intellectual prison, of a father who stifled his genius. He was so wrapped up in his own performance, so convinced of his own righteousness, that he didn't notice the looks on the jurors' faces shifting from curiosity to discomfort. He was describing a motive, a brilliant, articulate, and utterly damning motive. He was so busy playing the puppet master, pulling all the strings, that he didn't see the one string attached to his own back. The one that Prosecutor Rossi was gently, patiently holding, waiting for the perfect moment to pull. He had just handed her the reason he did it. All she had to do now was prove him wrong. There's a moment in every great story where everything you thought you knew gets turned upside down. The big reveal. The twist that changes the meaning of every single thing that came before it. This was that moment. Lucas had just finished his speech. He sat on the witness stand, calm and poised, having laid out his perfect logical case for why his father was a controlling prison warden of his mind. He truly believed he had won. You could see it in his eyes. He had presented his argument, and in his world, that was the end of the debate. Prosecutor Rossi stood up. She didn't approach him aggressively. She just stood at her table, holding a single sheet of paper. A gatekeeper, she repeated, her voice quiet, but it carried to every corner of the silent courtroom. A man who stood between you and your destiny. That's what you believed, isn't it, Lucas? It's not a belief, Lucas corrected her, a faint, condescending smile on his lips. It's an observation of fact. An observation, Rossi said, nodding slowly. She looked down at the paper in her hand, then back at him. Let's talk about observations, then. Let's talk about facts. Did you ever observe your father having lapses? Moments of confusion? Trouble finding a word, perhaps. Lucas's smile tightened. He was wary now. This was an unexpected line of questioning. Everyone has moments of forgetfulness. How about tremors? Rossi pressed, her voice still gentle. A slight shake in his hands. Maybe he dropped a coffee cup recently? Struggled with a button. Lucas said nothing, but a tiny furrow appeared between his brows. He was searching his memory, and he was finding things. Small things he'd dismissed. Rossi took his silence as an answer. She held up the paper. Your Honor, permission to approach the witness with what has been marked as State's Exhibit 42, the medical diagnosis of David Michael Thorne. The judge nodded. As Rossi walked toward the stand, Lucas's eyes locked onto that piece of paper. For the first time, he looked uncertain. The perfectly constructed chessboard of his mind was sensing a piece it hadn't accounted for. Rossi placed the document on the ledge in front of him. She didn't even look at it. She looked only at him. Your father, David Thorne, was diagnosed 6 months ago with Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, she said, her words clear and precise, dropping into the quiet room like stones into a still pond. It's a rare, degenerative, and invariably fatal brain disorder. The doctors gave him a year to live. At most. She let that hang in the air. The entire courtroom seemed to lean forward. The symptoms include rapid dementia, memory loss, personality changes, and physical tremors. There is no treatment. There is no cure. Lucas was staring at the paper, but his eyes weren't reading it. They were wide, unblinking. The cogs in his brilliant mind were grinding to a halt. He refused to sign your forms for the Caldwell Institute, Lucas, not to control you, Rossi said, her voice softening with a devastating pity. But because he was a dying man. A dying man who knew he only had a handful of months left with the son he loved more than anything in this world. He wanted you home. He was being selfish, yes. But it was the selfishness of a drowning man clinging to a life raft. She took a step closer, her voice now barely a whisper, but it echoed in the silence. He didn't tell you because he didn't want you to see him deteriorate. He didn't want your last memories of him to be of a man losing his mind, his dignity, himself. He wanted you to remember him as the strong, smart father you'd always known. He was trying to protect you from the horror of his death. She paused, letting the full, tragic weight of the truth crush down on him. The man you killed, Lucas, wasn't your jailer. He was a father trying to spend his last few months on Earth with his son. The prison you were so desperate to escape, it never existed. Lucas Thorne did not move. He did not cry out. He did not collapse. He simply broke. The arrogant, knowing look in his eyes shattered into a million pieces. The calm, superior mask melted away, revealing raw, utter, and complete confusion. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He looked at the prosecutor, then at the medical document, then at the jury, and you could see it, the foundation of his entire reality, the very reason he had done the unthinkable, dissolving into dust right in front of him. His logic, his brilliance, his perfect plan. It was all built on a lie. A catastrophic, heartbreaking misunderstanding. He had committed the perfect crime for a reason that was a complete fiction. The smartest person in the room had missed the most important fact of all. He slowly looked down at his own hands, resting on the wooden ledge of the witness stand. The hands that had held the rock, the bookend. And for the first time, a true, unscripted emotion flooded his face. It wasn't remorse. It wasn't guilt. It was the profound, world-ending horror of a man who has just realized he burned down his own house to kill a spider that was never there. There are some silences that are louder than any sound. The silence in a courtroom, waiting for a jury to come back, is one of them. It's a heavy, thick silence, filled with the weight of a dozen futures hanging in the balance. For Lucas Thorne, the wait was over. The jury had been out for less than a day. That's never a good sign for the defense. It means there wasn't much to debate. The truth, in all its horrible, tragic clarity, was just too obvious. The bailiff's voice cut through the quiet. All rise for the jury. Every person in that wood-paneled room stood up. The sound of shuffling feet, of rustling clothes, seemed deafening. Lucas, now in a suit that looked a little too big for him, stood with his lawyer. His head was bowed, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. The arrogant, calculating young man was gone. In his place was a hollowed-out shell. The truth had scooped him out. The 12 men and women of the jury filed in. They didn't look at him. They didn't look at his mother, who was sobbing quietly into a handkerchief. They looked straight ahead, their faces grim, their duty written in the tight lines around their mouths. The judge spoke. "Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict?" A woman in the front row stood up. She held a single piece of paper in her hand, and it might as well have been made of lead. "We have, Your Honor." The clerk took the paper and handed it to the judge. He read it, his face giving nothing away. He handed it back. "Please read the verdict." The air in the room became solid. You couldn't breathe. You could only wait. The foreperson cleared her throat. Her voice was steady, but it seemed to echo from 1,000 miles away. "On the count of murder in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant, Lucas Thorne, guilty." The word landed like a physical blow. Guilty. It's just a word. But in that context, in that room, it has the power to erase a life. A single sharp cry came from his mother's side of the room, then was quickly stifled. Reporters scribbled furiously. The artists' pencils flew across their pads. And Lucas? He didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He didn't look up. He simply closed his eyes. A long, slow blink. It was the reaction of someone who had seen this coming from 1,000,000 miles away. The final, logical conclusion to the catastrophic error he had made. His brilliant, perfect plan had ended exactly here, in this moment, with this word. Guilty. It was the answer to the equation he had started writing the night he smashed that window. He had just been too arrogant to see it until now. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of useless comfort. Lucas didn't seem to feel it. He was somewhere else. Maybe he was back in that dining room, hearing his father say, "No." Maybe he was in the kitchen, seeing the clean, shiny pen on the floor. Maybe he was just in the empty, dark space of his own mind, finally understanding the colossal, irreversible cost of being wrong. The judge set a date for sentencing. The formalities were wrapped up. The gavel fell. It was over. As the bailiffs moved in to lead him away, back to his cell, he finally looked up. His eyes scanned the room, not with defiance, but with a strange, empty clarity. He saw Detective Flores, watching him from the back of the room. There was no nod this time. No acknowledgement. Just the vacant look of someone who has finally, truly, lost the game. He turned and walked out of the courtroom, the heavy door closing behind him with a firm, final thud. The trial of Lucas Thorne was over. But the consequences, the long, dark shadow of what he had done and why he had done it, were just beginning. The brilliant boy was now a convicted murderer. And his life, as he knew it, was gone forever. You remember how this story started, don't you? With the crack of a gavel and a smile. We're back there now. But this time, we're not strangers looking in. This time, we know everything. The courtroom felt different on sentencing day. The excitement and drama of the trial were gone. What was left was the grim, clinical reality of justice. This wasn't about figuring out what happened anymore. It was about deciding what to do with the broken pieces. Lucas stood before Judge Evelyn Reed, his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked younger than he had during the trial. Smaller. The suit hung on him like a costume he'd taken off and couldn't quite get back on right. His eyes were downcast, but they weren't defeated. They were processing. His mother was in the front row, a handkerchief clutched in her white-knuckled hand. She wasn't crying anymore. She was just empty. She had lost her husband, and now, in every way that mattered, she was losing her son. Judge Reed adjusted her glasses. She looked at Lucas, and her gaze wasn't angry. It was weary. Profoundly, deeply weary. "Lucas Thorne," she began, her voice low and steady, filling the silent room. "In my 20 years on the bench, I have sentenced drug dealers, gang members, and violent predators. But I have never been in the presence of someone as dangerous as you." She let that hang in the air for a moment. The others, they were products of their environment. Of poverty, of addiction, of a lifetime of violence. You are a product of your own mind. A mind that is, without a doubt, brilliant. A mind that could have cured a disease, or built a company, or written laws. She leaned forward, peering at him over the rims of her glasses. But a mind without a conscience is a weapon. And you, young man, are the most loaded weapon I have ever encountered. You looked at human life, your own father's life, as a math problem. An obstacle to be solved. You planned his murder with the cold precision of a surgeon, and you executed it without a flicker of remorse. Until you were caught. Lucas didn't move. He was listening, absorbing her words like data. You sit here now, not sorry for what you did, but sorry that your calculation was wrong. You are sorry you were caught. You are sorry that the man you killed was dying, which makes your perfect crime look messy, illogical. And you hate that. She was speaking directly to the core of him, and for the first time, he looked up and met her eyes. There was a flicker of recognition there. She saw him. Truly saw him. "That is why I have no choice," Judge Reed continued, her voice gaining a steely finality. "I cannot sentence the boy you were. That boy is gone. I am sentencing the man you are, and the man you will forever be. A man who believes he is above the rules that govern the rest of us. A man who thinks his intellect places him outside the bounds of human morality." She took a deep breath. To release you would be to unleash a predator on the world. A predator who doesn't use claws or teeth, but logic and manipulation. Therefore, the sentence of this court is that you be committed to the Washington State Department of Corrections for the rest of your natural life. You will not be eligible for parole. There it was. Life. Without. The words that had seemed so abstract in Chapter 1 now had the weight of a tombstone. And then Lucas smiled. It wasn't the smile of a happy man. It wasn't even the cold, proud smile he'd given Detective Flores. This was different. This was a smile of tragic, horrifying understanding. In that moment, he heard the judge's words not as a punishment, but as a validation. She saw him as a unique monster, a one-of-a-kind threat. In his twisted logic, that was the ultimate compliment. She wasn't sentencing a normal criminal. She was containing a force of nature. His arrogance, even in the face of total ruin, was the one thing they couldn't take from him. It was the smile of a king who has lost his kingdom, but is still convinced of his divine right to rule. As the bailiffs led him away, he was still smiling that small, terrible smile. He had lost his freedom, his future, and the truth about his father. But in the prison of his own making, he was still the smartest one in the room. And for Lucas Thorne, that was all that had ever mattered. So, what happens to a mind like Lucas Thorne's when you put it in a cage? You might think it would wither. That the endless gray days, the clanging doors, the brutal monotony would break him. You'd be wrong. Lucas, now in his mid-20s, is in a maximum security prison. His world is a concrete box, a narrow bed, and a yard surrounded by razor wire. But for Lucas, the prison isn't the walls. It's the people around him. And he has found a way to turn them into his new kingdom. He became a jailhouse lawyer. It started small. He'd help other inmates write appeals, file motions, understand the labyrinthine rules of the legal system. But with his intellect, it didn't stay small for long. He's now famous inside those walls. They call him the Professor. Inmates from all over the prison system send him their cases. And he's good. Scary good. He's won appeals, gotten sentences reduced, and found loopholes that teams of real lawyers had missed. He spends his days surrounded by law books, a general commanding an army of words and precedents from his cell. He has an audience, a purpose, a puzzle that never ends. If you could talk to him and ask him about his father, you wouldn't hear remorse. You'd hear a cold, analytical frustration. He'll talk about the illogical emotionalism of the world. How a simple, factual misunderstanding led to an overly severe systemic response. He doesn't see himself as a murderer. He sees himself as the ultimate logician, condemned by a universe that refuses to follow the rules of reason. The system didn't break him. It just gave him a new, smaller universe to solve. He is still the puppet master, just with smaller, more desperate puppets. He is serving a life sentence, but in his mind, he has never been more free to be exactly who he is. And so, the story of Lucas Thorne ends not with a bang, but with a quiet, chilling hum of intellect behind bars. A brilliant light, shining in the dark, with no soul to guide it. A reminder that the most terrifying prison isn't the one made of concrete and steel, but the one we build for ourselves, out of our own arrogance. The story of Lucas Thorne is a stark reminder that the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones who lurk in the shadows, but the ones who can justify their darkness with brilliant light. If this exploration of a broken genius left you with a chill, subscribe. Because next time, we delve into the case of the Silent Night Killer, a story that proves sometimes the quietest people are hiding the loudest secrets.